Borders closed overnight, trade routes flipped direction. Within weeks of sanctions meant to isolate all governments, entire cargo networks shifted elsewhere, quietly undoing years of assumed leverage held by coastal states. What could this mean for you if Ibrahim Traore is helping that shift? Because what happened next is what analysts still struggle to explain. You are about to hear something most public briefings never spell out directly because it exposes how power actually operates when logistics, geography, and timing intersect behind closed doors. You will gain a clearer lens to read real shifts early. This is not casual information. Ignore this moment and the situation can look like routine regional trade news when it is actually a structural test of influence that determines who holds leverage over supply lines, pricing pressure, and political negotiation space. Many observers misread developments like this because they track announcements instead of systems. They watch statements instead of corridors. They measure speeches instead of cargo flows. Missing that layer often means realizing too late that the balance already moved. Those who understand it early rarely react in panic because they can see pressure building before it becomes visible to everyone else. What analysts first dismissed as temporary disruption is now understood as structural repositioning, and one number explains why within weeks, thousands of trucks shifted routes across West Africa. That single logistical surge confirmed the change was not symbolic but operational, answering the question raised earlier about what this means. Ibrahim Traore is helping steer it. The chain reaction began with sanctions intended to isolate Sahel military governments after the July 26, 2023 coup in Niger. Border closures were expected to choke supply lines and trigger internal pressure. Instead, the restrictions produced a different effect. Trade did not stop. Corridors that had existed for decades suddenly lost traffic, while alternatives gained volume almost overnight. The root cause traces back to geography shaped long before current leaders took office. Mali and Burkina Faso sit deep inland, historically dependent on coastal neighbors for access to global markets. Colonial infrastructure planning concentrated ports and rail links in select coastal territories, creating a structural dependency that functioned as a quiet form of influence. Control the corridor, and leverage follows automatically. That arrangement persisted for decades because switching routes carried high cost and complexity. Yet pressure changed incentives. Economic restrictions framed by authorities as external coercion were presented domestically as proof of dependency. That narrative resonated with populations already skeptical of foreign influence. Civilian populations felt the immediate strain of stalled imports, rising prices, and delayed supplies, making the crisis visible on streets before it was fully understood in policy circles. A transport operator in the region described watching lines of halted trucks stretch along the border highway, engines off, drivers waiting without clear timelines. Rerouting orders arrived, convoys turned, warehouses adjusted manifests. Contracts were renegotiated. What looked like chaos was actually adaptation in real time. The result is a shift that analysts now view not as a temporary workaround but as a turning point. Among regional observers, one figure kept appearing in briefings and field reports as a reference point for interpreting the shift. Ibrahim Traore, whose position at the center of Sahel decision-making made him a natural guide for analysts trying to understand the pattern. Rather than being treated simply as a political leader, he was increasingly viewed as a signal reader. Someone whose responses helped outside observers decode what was unfolding across borders and trade corridors. One early incident illustrates why. A policy analyst monitoring transport data noticed that shortly after sanctions tightened, routing contracts tied to traditional coastal gateways began expiring without renewal. When asked why, a logistics manager replied that uncertainty about border reliability made long-term agreements risky. That single explanation revealed a deeper reality: businesses were reacting faster than governments. A second example confirmed the pattern. In another corridor, customs brokers reported that documentation systems were being synchronized with new transit partners to reduce clearance delays. That step required coordination across agencies, which rarely happens unless participants expect the change to last. It showed that what looked like an emergency adjustment was already becoming institutional practice. Placed side by side, these moments signaled something larger than isolated reactions. They suggested a coordinated adaptation spreading through commercial networks, not a temporary disruption waiting to reverse. Analysts following Ibrahim Traoré Burkina Faso developments began treating each logistical adjustment as a clue rather than a coincidence. From that point on, the situation no longer looked temporary, pressure built. Then everything accelerated. Most Sahel cargo moved along long-established coastal corridors. After sanctions, those routes stalled while alternatives activated, marking the turning point that observers linked to decisions made within the same strategic circle as Ibrahim Traoré. First came the trigger: borders shut, convoys halted, checkpoints filled, goods waited, engines idled, drivers slept beside trailers. Then responses began: contracts shifted, routes redrawn, dispatch centers recalculated distances, insurance terms rewritten, shipping firms reassessed ports. Momentum intensified. Warehouses rerouted inventory. Brokers changed filings. Importers renegotiated delivery dates. Retailers adjusted prices. Transport unions issued new guidance. Each move fed the next. Action produced reaction. Reaction produced adaptation. Adaptation produced momentum. Next came the surge. Cargo volumes rose along newly favored corridors. Port handlers increased shifts. Customs teams accelerated processing. Road carriers reassigned fleets. Dispatch radios stayed active through the night. Silence spread where it stopped. Then the aftershock phase settled in. Regions that once depended on transit traffic watched revenue thin. Border towns built around truck stops or fewer vehicles. Fuel sales dropped. Storage yards emptied. Meanwhile, alternative routes experienced the opposite. More drivers arrived, more cargo passed, more contracts formed. Some consequences became visible immediately. Others appeared slowly. Logistics systems, once reconfigured, tend to stay that way because reverting costs more than continuing. Businesses that invested in new routes had little incentive to reverse unless conditions dramatically changed. That economic inertia quietly locked in the shift. By the time many institutions realized what was happening, the transition was already underway. The timeline did not unfold over years. It compressed into weeks. And in structural systems, speed often determines who gains leverage before anyone else reacts. Serious analysis begins when impressions give way to measurement. Observers studying the corridor shift emphasized that understanding scale requires stepping back from headlines and looking at baseline conditions before comparing what changed. That comparison reveals why analysts tracking the Sahel situation began treating this not as a political story but as a systems transformation. Before the disruption, inland Sahel economies relied heavily on a small number of maritime access routes controlled by coastal neighbors. Those same economies suddenly operated with multiple viable corridors. That shift from single-path dependence to multi-route access signals reduced vulnerability to pressure through border closures. One figure captures the scope: reports described hundreds, and in some estimates thousands of trucks stranded when restrictions first hit. That number shows the immediate logistical shock footprint across supply networks. Another indicator reveals speed. Within weeks, shipping lines reassessed discharge ports and redirected cargo, previously routed through long dominant gateways. That pace demonstrates how rapidly commercial systems can reorganize when incentives change. A third metric highlights human impact. Civilian populations felt shortages and price increases. Soon after, border closures disrupted deliveries of fuel, food, medicine, and construction materials. That data point shows how quickly policy decisions translate into daily life pressure. Together, these numbers form a pattern. Scale confirms it was large. Speed confirms it was fast. Human effect confirms it was real. Analysts emphasize that structural shifts rarely announce themselves with declarations. Freight manifests, customs throughput, and transport insurance pricing. Those indicators often move weeks before official narratives catch up. This is why the episode carries weight beyond regional politics. It demonstrates that infrastructure access, not speeches or declarations, determines who holds leverage in trade systems. Once a corridor proves viable, it changes bargaining dynamics for years. The implication is difficult to ignore. This was not just disruption. It was proof of capacity. Some analysts argue that the situation is being overstated, and that perspective deserves careful attention before drawing conclusions. They point out that trade rerouting during political disputes has happened before and often reverses once tensions ease. From that view, what looks like a strategic shift could simply be a temporary adjustment driven by short-term uncertainty, rather than a lasting transformation. They also note that new corridors face risks, especially when they pass through regions affected by insecurity, which could undermine reliability and push companies back to older routes. That argument has strength because logistics decisions are ultimately commercial, not ideological. Delays increase or safety deteriorates, transport operators tend to abandon new paths quickly. Historical precedent shows that many emergency trade routes fade once original corridors reopen. From this standpoint, observers who interpret the current shift as permanent might be projecting long-term meaning onto what is still an unsettled transition. A second counterpoint focuses on financing and infrastructure. Building durable alternatives requires investment in rail links, roads, and port capacity, often unfunded by external partners. Critics say that without sustained capital access, especially from major financial institutions, new logistics alignments may struggle to scale enough to replace older systems. They argue that structural independence requires not just rerouting trucks but securing long-term funding, maintenance, and security across entire corridors. Yet when both perspectives are placed side by side, a clearer picture emerges. The skeptics correctly highlight uncertainty and risk. At the same time, current evidence shows that companies already invested resources to adapt to the new routes, and such sunk costs tend to anchor future decisions. But in recognizing that the situation is neither illusion or certainty, it is a real shift, still deciding how permanent it will become. What altered the trajectory was not a speech, not a treaty, and not a headline. It was the quiet realization among logistics planners that one coastal state had chosen not to enforce restrictions the same way others did, leaving a commercial opening that traders quickly used. That single policy difference created a corridor where goods could still move, and once traffic began flowing there consistently, the route started transforming from workaround into system. This moment marked the midpoint where the story stopped being about pressure and started being about adaptation. The implications were immediate. Shipping companies recalculated costs and saw viable margins. Customs authorities accelerated documentation alignment to reduce delays. Transport firms reassigned fleets to match demand. None of these actions required political declarations, yet together they changed regional trade geometry. The effect multiplies. What makes this development striking is how ordinary it looks on the surface. Trucks drive, ports load. Papers clear, nothing dramatic. Yet beneath that routine motions it's a structural shift. And networks rarely revert once efficiency improves. That realization is why many observers now suspect the visible story so far is only the outer layer of a deeper transformation still unfolding. The consequences did not stay on paper. Into budgets, into decisions people could feel. What began as a logistical adjustment started to ripple outward, and that ripple helps explain why observers tracking signals around Ibrahim Traoré began focusing less on announcements and more on outcomes. For governments, the shift altered negotiating leverage. States that once held influence because they controlled key transit corridors suddenly faced reduced traffic and declining transit income, fewer transport fees, and weaker bargaining power in regional discussions. Administrations that had relied on corridor traffic as a stable economic pillar now had to reconsider fiscal projections and policy priorities. Political leverage changes with it. Businesses experienced a different set of effects. Logistics firms had to adapt quickly to new routes, renegotiate contracts, and reassess risk calculations. Some companies gained opportunities by operating along emerging corridors, while others lost market share when traditional routes or fewer shipments. And importers recalculated costs based on distance, fuel, and processing times. Profit margins shifted not because demand changed, but because geography did. Ordinary citizens felt the transition most directly. Early in the disruption, stalled deliveries caused shortages and price increases for essential goods such as fuel, food, and medicine. Households faced tighter budgets. Traders dealt with delayed inventory. Workers connected to transport sectors saw hours fluctuate depending on where cargo flowed. For many families, the geopolitical story translated into a simple reality: daily expenses became less predictable. Across the wider region, the realignment carried strategic weight. The emergence of alternative corridors showed that access to global markets does not have to depend on a single gateway. That possibility alone changes how countries calculate risk, alliances, and long-term infrastructure plans. Regional organizations must now consider how to maintain influence when economic pressure no longer guarantees compliance. The pattern is unmistakable. The shift touched policy, profit, and people at the same time. The most likely path is neither collapse nor triumph, but gradual recalibration. Trade will probably continue flowing through a mix of routes while companies compare cost, reliability, and security. If current trends persist, the region may settle into a new equilibrium where no single corridor dominates completely, giving inland states more flexibility but also forcing them to manage more complex logistics. In that baseline scenario, change continues, though not explosively, and the system stabilizes around diversification rather than dependence. A more optimistic outcome is possible if coordination improves among transit countries and infrastructure projects gain funding. Expanded rail links, streamlined customs systems, and cooperative security measures could reduce transport costs and delays, allowing emerging corridors to become efficient long-term arteries of commerce. Under that scenario, the shift associated with Ibrahim Traoré's regional alignment signals would be remembered as the early phase of a broader modernization cycle that strengthened economic resilience across multiple states. The worst-case trajectory would unfold if instability deepens along key transit zones or financing dries up for infrastructure maintenance. In that case, new routes could become unreliable, insurers could raise costs, and companies might retreat to older corridors despite political tensions. That outcome would not simply slow progress. It would restore earlier dependencies and intensify competition for control over limited gateways. The important point is not predicting which scenario will win. It is recognizing that each remains plausible, and that decisions made now will shape which direction becomes reality. Careful observation, not assumptions, is the safest strategy when systems are still moving. After seeing the broader landscape and the possible paths ahead, the question becomes personal. What does all of this actually mean for someone watching from afar, trying to understand where events are heading and whether they matter beyond headlines? The answer depends on how closely one chooses to pay attention. For those who actively follow global developments, this moment offers an advantage. How sanctions reshape incentives, and how regional actors respond gives them a clearer sense of direction before trends become obvious. That awareness can help them interpret future news with more context and less confusion, especially when narratives conflict or evolve quickly. Staying informed, comparing sources, and watching indicators rather than rhetoric allows this group to remain ahead of sudden changes. For people indirectly affected, the impact is subtler but still real. Economic shifts in one region can influence prices, markets, and supply chains elsewhere. Even without direct involvement, they may notice changes through cost fluctuations, job markets, or investment patterns tied to global trade stability. Preparing mentally for volatility, adjusting expectations, and planning with flexibility can reduce stress when external events ripple outward. Then there are those who assume the story has nothing to do with them. Choosing not to engage is understandable, yet it carries risk. When major structural shifts unfold unnoticed, they tend to feel sudden only because their early signals were ignored. Awareness does not require constant attention, only a willingness to understand the basics before consequences arrive. Wherever someone stands, knowledge itself becomes a form of stability. Real solutions cannot remain slogans. If structural shifts in trade and power are already underway, then responses must be equally concrete, measurable, and timed. Observers examining developments tied to Ibrahim Traore increasingly stress that outcomes will depend not on declarations but on coordinated execution across several levels at once. At the leadership level, authorities must clarify transit policies and infrastructure priorities within defined timelines. That means identifying which corridors will receive investment, assigning agencies responsible for implementation, and measuring progress through visible indicators such as reduced clearance times, improved road reliability, or expanded cargo throughput. Without timelines and metrics, even well-intended strategies risk evolving into ambiguity. For businesses and logistics systems, the priority is operational adaptation. Transport firms need route diversification plans, insurers must recalibrate risk models, and port operators should upgrade handling capacity where demand is rising. Success can be measured through delivery consistency, cost stability, and reduced delay frequency. These indicators reveal whether adjustments are functioning in practice rather than only on paper. Communities and individuals also have a role, though smaller in scale. Workers can monitor industry trends that affect employment stability. Local groups can track price patterns and availability of essential goods. Progress at this level is visible through improved preparedness, steadier access to necessities, and fewer sudden disruptions in daily life. Regional cooperation could strengthen all three layers: joint transit agreements, shared customs platforms, and coordinated security measures would create predictability that benefits every participant. Plans matter only when carried out. Earlier, there was that quiet moment when a transport analyst realized contracts were expiring without renewal and drivers were waiting beside silent trucks, unsure which road would matter tomorrow. That image returns now because it captures how this entire journey unfolded, not through spectacle, but through small decisions accumulating until they reshaped a region. Observers who followed signals connected to Ibrahim Traore watched those details the way navigators watch stars, knowing direction reveals itself long before destinations appear. From the first halted convoy to the emergence of new corridors, the path has traced a clear arc. What began as pressure turned into adaptation. What looked temporary began to persist. What seemed local began to influence wider calculations, step by step. The story moved from uncertainty toward structural change, and anyone who followed closely has already felt that shift in perspective. At its core, this is not only about trade routes or political blocs. It is about how systems respond when constraints collide with incentives, and how human decisions quietly reshape forces that once seemed fixed. That realization carries weight because it shows that outcomes are rarely decided in a single dramatic moment. Through choices repeated until they become reality. The map changes where pressure meets preparation. Moments like this tend to linger after the facts are understood, because each listener draws a different meaning from them. Some hear a story about strategy, others hear one about resilience, and some simply recognize that they have just followed a chain of events that connects distant decisions to real-world consequences. If this account feels worth passing along to someone else who tries to make sense of global shifts, sharing it can help widen that circle of understanding so more people can see the signals early instead of after outcomes are obvious. Conversations that grow from shared awareness often become the place where deeper insight forms, especially when different perspectives meet and challenge each other constructively. So rather than ending with a conclusion, it may be more useful to leave a question open for reflection. When systems begin changing quietly, what is the most important sign that tells you the shift is real? And wherever you stand, you are not the only one thinking about it.